My soul is restless until it rests in thee. Augustine begins literally at the beginning. And when I mean at the beginning, it means at the beginning of his particular life. And not just in the beginning of the particular life that he can remember, but rather he begins from literal childhood, being a baby, and tracking a little bit of his growth and development all the way up until he's a later teenager. But you might have noticed throughout the first chapter that Augustine was not simply recounting his life from his perspective, but rather he was trying to cast a much wider net in a particular direction that, again, shows how subtle a thinker that Augustine was. He was not simply interested in recounting his particular life. He was interested in thinking on a much wider scale about existence, what it means to be created, what it means to be beloved by God, and what it means to follow in the ways of God as it comes to all of these particular physical functions of early life. The fascinating thing about this first chapter is that you'll notice in the very beginning of the chapter, Augustine doesn't even begin with himself. Instead, Augustine begins with existence itself. This wonderful kind of psalmist sort of praising of God for existence. And likewise, a sort of examination or reflection, theological reflection, over what it means to exist at all. There's a couple of wonderful lines in the beginning that Augustine asks some rhetorical questions of God, in that, how can it be, Lord God, that you have created all things, and yet you are so intimately connected with those things? The question of God's infinity comes up. You who are infinite has created something finite, and yet you have chosen to be contained by the finite. In other words, how can it be, Lord, that you who have created us, creatures, have deigned to dwell within us, creatures? How does that work? Augustine is sort of interrogating God. How can that which is finite contain the infinite? It's a wonderful reflection because it gets at a little bit of what Augustine is going to be beginning to reflect on over the next several chapters of Book 1. Small note about the structure. You'll note that we're dealing with Book 1 and the chapters within. It's an interesting, it's a ancient, more archaic way of talking about a particular section of a work and then the subsections of the work. But it's also helpful to understand that Henry Chadwick notes in the introduction, these particular sections of the Confessions were actually meant for out loud oration. They were not meant as simply just to be read. They were actually written to be said out loud. So the sort of artful way that they're written, again, like the psalmist, he's going to rely on the Psalms a lot, and you'll see those references throughout your book, that he relies on Psalms because he's praising God. This is a prayer to God that we just happen to be listening in on. Anyway, he begins to then move from the idea of existence, then into the idea of particular existence. And as it gets to particular existence, in other words, creation, so what does it mean to be a baby? Augustine has a complex reflection on what it means to be a child. And in some ways, Augustine has a fair bit of parental insight in this. He notes of his own self that, when it should be that the child is born, what good is the child? What purpose does the child have other than simply just to be? And he has this kind of interesting reflection over creating God's creative aspects being kind of shot through the birthing process. And likewise, as young babies, that they're, as Augustine kind of notes, not really good for anything other than desiring that which helps them grow. And in that same sort of way, he has this a kind of realistic idea or realistic reflection over how God, in God's own way, creates the created order, not for anything that the created order does for God, but rather out of a simple loving act, a pure act of love. And this pure act of love is what Augustine is really seeding the rest of his reflection off of. That it's not anything that the baby can do for me. It's not anything that my child can do for me. It rather is a pure act of love and care of, even though this baby is good for nothing except for sleeping, eating, and making dirty diapers, right? That at the same time, there is a delight and a joy in from the parental side of this beautiful creation that, again, serves us no utility. And in that, Augustine launches off into one of his first sort of meta-reflections. The Confessions are going to oscillate between personal reflection, so Augustine's own personal reflection on himself, into a bigger reflection on bigger aspects of the world. One of Augustine's first indications that he's going to do this is when he begins to look at not just the parental-child relationship as it comes to babies, but as it comes to the parallel sort of metaphor of God and creation, or particularly God and humanity. When God creates humanity, the creation aspect of humanity is that they are meant to have the fullness of God, or the fullness of the image of God in their persons. As it says in the Genesis creation story, that God created them male and female. He created them in the image of God. God created them. So Augustine then reflects, what does this mean? What does it mean that we bear the image of God? And what does it mean that for creation to bear an imprint of the Creator? How exactly does creation rely on the Creator? And what exactly does creation do for the Creator? Does creation do anything necessary for God? Is creation necessary for God's existence? Well, Augustine, again, is going to rely on some fairly common theistic assumptions. That, again, is theistic assumptions that have endured as it comes to ancient Near Eastern monotheism. But you heard some of them within the first chapter. God is infinite. He's already talked about that. God, in his infinity, contains within his own self everything necessary, which means that God does not necessarily need anything outside of himself. God is not reliant, or a fancy philosophical word, God is not contingent on anything else. And the word contingent simply means it is not necessary for God to rely on anything outside of himself for his existence. God doesn't need to eat or sleep or, any of these normal sort of human functions. God does not need those things in order for God to exist. And importantly, God does not need any of those things for God to exist fully. God's existence is already fully realized, and there's no need for anything outside of himself. However, the creative aspect of God does not mean that the creation made by God was therefore simply a fun project of God. For example, it could be that God is perfectly self-sufficient, and that just for fun God does something. Well, God can do something just for fun. God can make creation just for fun, but in the same sort of way that maybe you and I could do something just for fun, we could have no particular buy-in or no particular sort of relationship to the thing that we do. So like, for example, if I were to paint a picture, it could be that I paint a picture just for fun. And it was fun painting the picture, but then if that picture doesn't mean anything to me and I simply throw it away, then what kind of relationship to that picture did I have? Well, in some ways, I had a sort of utilitarian relationship with that picture, right? I only made the picture for what it brought to me. And if I deemed it not necessary, or I deemed it that it doesn't do anything for me, then I simply get rid of it. Well, that's a very utilitarian thought about looking at the picture. However, anybody who's a parent will know that pictures that their child makes is something that is, akin to going to the paintings at the Louvre, right? Whenever your children bring home pictures that they've made and things like that, it is kind of stereotypical for the fridge front door to have pictures or drawings that your children make. And yet, from the parent's perspective, that sort of creative outlet is something that is precious. It's something that, again, it's not mere utility. If I were to look at that picture, that kind of hastily drawn picture of, I'm not exactly sure what it is, it's not anything utilitarian about that, but rather it's simply its ontology. And the word ontology means the actual existence of the thing. It's not about how I use it, that's what utility is, but actually it's about the ontology of the thing, what the thing actually is that is meaningful. It is something. It is something on its own. Well, in a similar way, Augustine reflects on it, on creation and human existence in the same way. Whereas God has no necessary utility to use the creation, because, again, God does not need anything outside of himself. So therefore, God does not have a mere utilitarian relationship to the creation. In fact, if we kind of take it to its logical conclusion, as Augustine is pushing us towards, creation, by its necessity, has no utility function for God, because there is no necessary aspect of God's need for creation. And that means that God has a completely different relationship to the creation than simply what he gets out of it. And in that way, Augustine then shifts focus to the relationship between parent and child, particularly between mother and child. He has a very physical reflection over nursing, where he says that that I, as a child, and I was told this as a child, he writes in this book, that as a baby, I would make various sounds that told my nurse or told my mom that I was hungry or I was uncomfortable. And these various interpretations of these baby cooing was able to be interpreted by the parents because they were paying attention. But also the fact that babies rely completely on their mothers for their substance because of the milk given in nursing. They have no other sustenance that they are able to rely on, and they rely on that source for all of their being, really. I believe even Augustine even quotes the Psalm where it says that God gives creation its food in due season. This idea that just as I relied on my mom completely for my substance, so also, and again, Augustine reflects on the bigger, so also we as humans rely completely on God. And yet, he then begins a reflection on human nature. So human ontology, the being of humanity, is distinct from the will within humanity. This is a key distinction. This is a huge distinction. Because when Augustine begins to reflect over the role between the will within humanity, that's when Augustine can begin to speak about the deficiency of will, the deficiency of of what it means for me to be an actor or an agent. An agent, by the way, is a word in philosophy that means something that has a will and an ability to execute that will. So humanity, human beings are agents. We have a will and an ability to execute that will. Regardless of whether that will is directed towards the evil or the good, we have the ability to affect that which we are willing on the inside. But Augustine makes a note about, he observed babies that were, again, brothers, that were nursing from the same mother, presumably twins. But he noticed that when it should be that one brother was being cared for, the other brother, instead of recognizing that that his own blood brother was in complete reliance on the mother, the blood brother, he said, looked with a level of envy, a level of covetousness towards the brother. There was a level in which even as a young baby, that looking at the other child as taking something from the other child, even though that was not the case. There's, as Augustine himself knows, that it was silly to think this. There was plenty of sustenance to go around. There was plenty of nursing to go around. At the same time, there was something within the brother looking at the other with envy or with covetousness that spoke to something deeper for Augustine, which is that there's something wrong with this picture. It shouldn't be that we have this relationship between two brothers and the mom who's taking care of them. It shouldn't be that that's the case, and yet it is. And Augustine again expounds, it should not be that we as humans are envious of what each other have when we all rely on God ultimately for everything that we are given. That just as it shows that something's wrong to be envious of someone receiving their food that they need, so also it is parallel to when we as adults, as Augustine is saying, and we as adults are envious or strife with each other when we all rely on God for what we're given. So, you see, Augustine is not talking about the ontology of the people, okay? He's not talking about their created existence. What he's talking about is the relationship between how we are viewing others, or how we are looking at others. Sight is a really important concept for Augustine. How am I looking at someone else? And how am I conceiving of who someone is? Which, again, speaks to a little bit of an interesting tension that Augustine notes even in early childhood. We have a limited perspective on what exactly the nature of the world is. And that limited perspective is not something in which we need to stay in forever, but that's something that we need to grow past. Augustine, even, by the way, makes a note that, of course, we tolerate these sort of childhood envies and quarrelings because we have an assumption, Augustine writes, that we'll grow out of this as we get older. But Augustine also notes that for those who grow older and don't grow out of those particular tendencies, he said that we, as those who grow into maturity, look at those people with disdain. We actually distance ourselves from those people because they've not learned to grow up. They've not learned to grow out of this sort of sibling quarreling relationship. And Augustine begins to reflect on, as he begins to chart the course of growth, growing out of babyhood into a young person, into children that are growing into their relationships and learning how to have relationships, but also learning that their internal struggles with their own selves and the people around them are beginning to form them in ways that are going to have consequences down the road. Augustine begins to reflect on the concept of growing out of ways of thinking. And how are we able to grow out of the ways in which we are restricting ourselves? In other words, instead of like the baby, how are we growing out of mere envy of the other person into a recognition that the other needs something just as much as I do? This, by the way, it's not the same word that Augustine would use here, but this is a key psychological concept called empathy. When we are able to have a recognition or a literal feeling, when we are able to feel what the other person feels, understanding what the other person understands, when we are able to, as the famous saying might say, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, when we're able to step outside of ourself on behalf of someone else to recognize what they need. This is really, really important. And again, Augustine is reflecting on concepts and ideas that, again, are way ahead of his time. And he's doing it in a way that he's self-examining. Again, he's talking about both himself to God, but he's also talking about the concept of what it means to grow up to God. So, as they continue to grow, they should necessarily grow out of certain destructive habits, and certainly they should grow into a certain perspective of being able to understand someone on their own integrity, outside of themselves, that are in need of certain things. But we also are importantly recognizing a tension here, which is that it is one thing for us to be able to grow up and out of ourselves. However, there is also a tendency within ourselves, a natural tendency, in which we are putting ourselves first. We want ourselves to be first. And that can be the case within relationships. That can be the case within friendships. That can be the case within romantic endeavors. And that can be the case also as it comes to our pleasure and our pain. We are still self-centered. We are still self-aggrandizing. And Augustine tracks some of this as he grows up. And as Augustine gets later in the chapter, he again is still reflecting on this relationship between God and creation as a parallel between the relationship between Christ and humanity. When it comes to the relationship between God and creation, this idea that creation has its own integrity. If creation has its own integrity, and if God doesn't distance himself from creation, but rather God allows creation to have its own say in how it moves and functions, not apart from God, but rather as an actual creative sort of expression of its creator. In the same way, humanity, paralleling this in the parent-child relationship, how is the parent both intimately involved with the child, but at the same time not at the expense of the child's own growth? This is, again, really interesting how someone in the 300s and 400s AD was writing over what we have been trying to do in clinical psychology for the past 150 years. It's really fascinating how Augustine had such a keen eye for this. We might disagree with some of his assertions based upon his observation, but nonetheless, he was doing some pretty interesting stuff back then. Well, the parallel that Augustine creates, which I think is a really interesting parallel, is that just as the parent is still involved with the child's development, especially as it comes to the moral development, as it comes to schooling, as it comes to teaching, as it comes to learning. Just as the parent and child is involved in that sort of endeavor, so also it is how God and humanity are working. And this is where Augustine comes to going to school. This is, by the way, a lovely reflection from the perspective of the student. You get the picture of Augustine as sort of this uninterested, sort of dour school boy who's, grudgingly going to class, having to read these things he doesn't want to read, having to do these things he doesn't want to do. I mean, does that sound like anybody's child to them? Yeah, that's what Augustine is trying to say here, is that true to his experience, and I think true to our experience too. I mean, I can think about whenever I went to school, I absolutely was not into some subjects, and I was definitely not into certain assignments. I didn't want to read some of those books. But Augustine also notes that he was glad that he was made to read those things. He then begins to reflect on a different aspect of the relationship between parent and child. The different aspect as it means to acquiring knowledge. Augustine begins to reflect on aesthetic. And the word aesthetic simply is referring to the idea, not simply a concept, but an actual experience of the beautiful. And the experience of the beautiful is not simply confined to looking at an art piece, but actually involves the arts themselves, such as speech, such as language. It can involve art, but it also can involve story. Augustine talks at length about how he loved Latin stories and he despised Greek stories. He did not like his Greek studies. He really preferred Latin. But at the same time, he has an aesthetic eye. He likes Latin. He likes things about Latin. He likes the language. And again, he likes the oration. He enjoyed his oration. Now, there are some assignments in which he was tasked with making the best oration, and begins to reflect on what does it mean to be the best at oration? Like how can we measure whether you're good at art, right? But that's later in the chapter. But his big reflection is over the acquiring of knowledge. What is the relationship between my desire to acquire certain kinds of knowledge, but not to acquire others? And what's the role between being made to acquire some knowledge that I didn't want to learn, but yet at the same time that I am so glad that I learned now? I'm so glad that I learned it now, rather than at the immediate point. It's actually an interesting reflection on the aspect of discipline. Discipline, by the way, is not simply discipline is not a synonym for punishment. Discipline is a synonym for being taught in a certain fashion, being taught in a certain way. Again, the word disciple is where you can kind of take that root word out. But discipline, as it comes to his study, provides some fodder for reflection for Augustine as it comes to things that I learned in my past that I hated learning in the moment, that I am so glad that I know now. Again, the role of learning things that I don't want to learn that turn out to be very necessary. That aspect is very present within his reflection on his adolescent learning. And again, his aesthetic eye, looking at the beauty of something. And we didn't get it in this chapter, but we're going to get it in later chapters. Augustine is setting up a really important talking point for him later in the chapters, because Augustine particularly has he has an internal draw towards the beautiful. And he reflects in later chapters on what it means to be drawn towards that which is beautiful. What exactly does it mean to be drawn towards the beautiful? And as Augustine is going to say in a more explicit fashion, being drawn towards the good. And the good is beautiful. Remember that. The good is beautiful, okay? Being drawn towards the aesthetic. In a way, Augustine also then relates this back to his earlier talk about God and creation. When God creates the world, God says that it is good. And in that it is good, Augustine creates that connection between the good and the beautiful. Again, it's subtle at this point. He's going to make it explicit later. The good and the beautiful are creations of God. That which is beautiful is of God. God is the highest beauty. In fact, Augustine refers to God in very lover-like language in several different types. My sweetness is what Augustine refers to God as in one part of this chapter. We almost see in Augustine's language between him and God as a love letter. And I'm not talking about simply a letter between friends, but an actual romantic love letter, in which Augustine is writing a romantic letter to God, because God is his sweetness. And that's not by accident, by the way, because again, the good and the beautiful, the aesthetic, Augustine believes is truly a creation of God. The aesthetic is truly a part of that creative process. And being able to create that which is beauty is, in fact, a necessary part of that equation. So that the good is beautiful, and the beautiful is good. The problem comes in, as Augustine notes, is in our perspective about those things, and in our utility about those things. Notice how there's a subtle undercurrent that Augustine set up at the very beginning of this chapter about the baby does nothing for me, and yet I love the baby as a parent. God has no necessity for the creation, but God loves the creation. Notice that the relationship that Augustine is setting up between the parent and child, between God and creation, is one that is born not of utility, but born of sacrificial love for the other. Augustine is going to subtly weave that into everything that he talks about. And in his adolescence, he talks about how he has that relationship completely wrong. He uses other people. He uses other things. He uses his ability in order to accomplish certain things. He uses his natural skill in order to outclass his classmates. He uses things. That is key to how Augustine is viewing his earlier understanding of himself. He had love all wrong. Love is not the use of something else. Love is the complete and utter self-giving to someone else. Self-sacrifice for someone else. And again, God creates, self-gives to the world out of no interest in using the creation, but out of a complete loving interest of seeing something come into being. The aesthetic, the beautiful, the creative, but completely not in a utilitarian fashion. There is no act of love for Augustine that is necessitated by their use or by their usefulness. Rather, the loving act of God has nothing to do with that other than the perfect self-giving act of love for the other. A seeing of the other's needs. Again, think about the blood brothers who needed the same sustenance from their mother. A recognition of what the need of the other is. As Augustine then bridges into his later adolescence, we will get that in chapter 2. But I leave you with a couple of important concepts that Augustine has brought up so far. The concept of ontology, what something actually creatively is distinct from the will that someone might have. The will is distinct from the creation themselves, but they are completely a part of each other. and they are also, in some cases, at war with each other. We are created good, but our wills are bent towards ourselves. And in that bentness of the will, we then create that which is bad. We are, again, creative in that way, but the ways in which we create that is bad is by the use of good things in ways in which they were not meant to be used. Right? The use of things for the self. But also think about the aesthetic, the beautiful. That which is created is good. That which is created is beautiful. The beauty of that which is made. And likewise, the beauty of which we can be involved in, such as poetry, such as story, such as language, craft, creation. Those things have an aesthetic beauty to them, but they also can be used in the wrong fashion. And again, the big concept of this first chapter is the contention between the creative, loving act of God, purely of self-giving, and the utilitarian use of other things for myself. Pay attention to those particular sorts of contentions as we begin to move later in Augustine's life, and pay attention to how Augustine is setting up the stage for talking about some of the hardest parts of his life that involve the wrong use of love.